back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. Today, we're talking about grief and divorce. How do you recognize it? And especially, how do you heal from it? To talk about this, I've invited Karen Omand. She's a certified thanatologist. She's got degrees in sociology and thanatology, and she specializes in grief and loss. She's got over a decade of experience. Karen's guided many people through the complexities of loss and recovery, and she's drawn from her own life experience in high conflict divorce, parental loss, and abusive marriage. In 2021, Karen co-founded the Divorce Workshop with the objective of empowering individuals on their divorce journey. She's the co-author of the Divorce Workbook as well. Karen, it's really nice to have you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on. I look forward to a great discussion.
I really am looking forward to tapping into all your knowledge, because I know that you've studied grief extensively in the context of death, but you're now, of course, working in the space of divorce. So are there a lot of similarities in the way people experience grief through death and through divorce?
Yeah, actually, it was interesting too. When I first started this field, I was doing a lot of death counseling, like loss from a death loss, which is the toughest thing that you go through in life, right? When you lose something you've attached to. But what I was noticing through my own experience as well, I started getting some clients going, they're struggling with some of the same symptoms and some of the same reactions from a non-death loss, such as a relationship breakup or a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, there's something here. And I remember going to, right before I separated from my husband, I went to a legal workshop. And I remember saying, the lawyers are asking, so what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a student in thanatology. And they said, oh my, Karen, do we ever need you? There's so much grief in divorce that goes unrecognized. And so that got me thinking. And then over the years, it started feeling stronger that there was a pull to do both. I do still death loss counseling, but also to make more awareness that this non-death loss of divorce or breakup, right, can be really, really hard. And there are similarities. I've noticed that there's similarities in the symptoms of the grief and of some of the recovery time too, right? Depending.
Yeah.
It is really what a lot of people are saying, and I'm trying to tell everybody, is a death of relationship. And it's really harder than what society can think it is for some people. So
yeah,
that's how I started.
And you mentioned symptoms. So in the context of divorce specifically, how does grief usually manifest itself? How can you tell that someone is struggling?
Well, I guess it depends. Let's remember that grief is so unique for everybody. So for you, maybe it showed up in digestive issues, right? Or I have a client that she was with another client, like she's a professional who's doing work, and she started crying in front of her own client. And she said it was because of the loss of the divorce. It was sneaking out of her, right? Because sometimes with people in major transitions and struggle like divorce, even in grief and death loss, they try to avoid it. And grief will come out. Grief will come out either through you'll get sick, or you'll be irritable, or you'll be angry. Sometimes they always say, if you're very, very angry, really at deep down at the core, you're very, very hurt, right? For some things, right? Because sometimes anger is a good thing for boundaries reasons too, but for sometimes when you're really angry, it's because you really are hurt. So it can come up in cognitively too, like you can be a bit more forgetful. You can be clumsy for some I've had. Biologically, physiologically, because you as a couple, whether you're happy or not, probably most not like that happy, you're still physiologically connected to each other, right? So when you pull that apart, your attachment system goes all a mess. So physiologically, I think I said cognitively, behaviorally, right? Like stressed, irritable. So there's many different ways. We actually have in the workbook, I had to put it out there, but if anybody wants to DM you or me, and I'll send them the symptoms of grief for divorce, because I don't think many people are aware that there are so many symptoms, right?
I think there is a lack of awareness, and people who do experience divorce often mention it. They're mourning that relationship that they thought they were going to have. They're mourning the dream of that forever ever, happily ever after with that person. There's so much to accept as a loss as part of the divorce process, but it's not recognized, by society in the same way as the loss to death might be.
Yeah, there's you know, one of the professors when I was studying this in thanatology said the issue with divorce is it's subjective in nature. When you have someone that dies, that's for society, that is okay, that person dies, you need support.
Yeah.
Well, in divorce, you know, someone could say to you, well, Chloe, you didn't make it work.
Yeah.
Right? Or you get, why'd you stay so long? Right? And so they're not, you know, and then they also think is that they think society, divorce rates have been pretty high for a long time. They think, well, everyone's doing it. You don't really
Yeah.
need that much support. Right? So
Yep.
they kind of, society kind of just kind of, oh, well, this, oh, it's so sad. But really, like, you know, lots of people get divorced and you'll get through it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, for us who've been through it, it's a lot more than that, right? So it's really a major transition in life that we have to adjust and grieve.
Absolutely. And I think also, you know, with divorce in particular, because there's so much admin and so much, you know, paperwork that needs to happen, you get caught up in the process, and actually people forget to grieve because they don't
Mhm.
have time. They're dealing with all these decisions and all this uncertainty, and there's so much to do. They focus on
Mhm.
that, which is probably the right thing to do because they want to be able to move on, but actually they're not ready to move on psychologically, even though, you know,
Mhm.
administratively they might be. Do you see a
Mhm.
lot of that happening?
Oh yeah, but that even happens in death loss as well, right? There's a lot of
Yeah,
paperwork in death. There's a lot of
yeah,
paperwork
that's
in
true,
divorce,
actually. Yeah.
right? And so they'll avoid, and I call it for both the death loss and divorce is
Mhm.
like the ostrich syndrome, right? Where they tuck their head in and they don't. And I
Yeah.
get it. We can avoid for a while, but as I said to you at the beginning, you know, grief will come out. So, but as you said, you're overwhelmed. You have to find somewhere to live, maybe.
Mhm.
You've got to figure out make sure the kids are okay. You've got so many things coming at you legally, financially. Things have
Yeah.
changed. Shifting friendships, right? Like
Mhm.
there's so much going on, and so I always I'm sure you say something like this to your clients as well, but I always say it's like an ant eating an elephant. You just take a little bit every day
Yeah.
to try to get through it, because if not, you'll crash and burn, right? And
Yeah.
so yeah, there's a lot there, and I think you're right. Most clients, as well as even myself, I have to say, uh you know, I got involved into the stuff of divorce and not actually
Yeah.
feeling the divorce, right?
Yeah. Well, it's slightly easier in a way to deal with
Mhm.
paperwork than it is to deal with feelings.
Yeah,
And
because we like to
you're,
avoid those.
so you work with a lot of families who have been going through divorce and
Mhm.
dealing with the grief that comes with that. Do you see a big difference in how parents grieve or the couple grieve the
Mhm.
divorce versus children might?
Yeah, so parents, as I said to you before at the beginning, they're all unique and we all cope differently, right? You may say, like for me, one of the things that I did even before my divorce, because I want to also mention that you can be grieving for quite a while before you actually do legal divorce. That was me. And then you can be grieving during the divorce, you can be grieving after divorce. So it can show up, but we're all unique, right? For adults. Now, children, they kind of grieve behaviorally different. We have to watch, right? Like if you have a 4-year-old, they may regress, right? So a 3, 4-year-old may be more clingy, right? So their behaviors are different in how they express their feelings because they can't really. So, and then the tweens, right? They may be more like that 9 to 13, which I think is a really tough age. They may be more manipulative, or they may
Mm.
be more stomach aches. My youngest was 13 when I decided to leave, and she was experiencing a lot of stomach aches.
Wow, that's interesting.
There was some, yeah, so there's always like, oh, I have a tummy ache, I have a stomach ache. And so, and then for teenagers, right, like they may push for more autonomy or they may get
Yeah.
depressed. So I think for children, you have to be mindful of how they are grieving developmentally, right? Because
Yeah.
they are different than how we are, you know, we're older, we have all different coping styles, but we're not the same as children. So
Yeah.
they do definitely grieve differently and they'll show up differently. So you have to be mindful of how those behaviors. I would watch for their behaviors a lot. Um, the older kids watch for grades, um, and they will not. You know, interesting. Like the tweens to teenagers, you can over ask them how they're doing with the divorce.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
just don't do that. Yeah, like you know, you check in every once in a while. That is, let's remember that's not their life, right? It's
Yeah.
part of their life.
Especially teenagers. They're caught
Yeah.
up in their own thing.
Yeah. So children will show grief differently than adults will. So parents need to be look for that. Also, I want to mention, I just want parents aware that children do grieve the
Yes,
divorce.
that's a good starting point. Absolutely. We
They
often
do
forget that
definitely.
children grieve. Is that something that you see a lot?
Yeah, and I want to also mention, so in co-parenting, most of it's 50-50 now, right? We've seen that things are really getting 50-50, which is great for most couples. So you're grieving 50% of the time that the children aren't there, right? Just remember they could be grieving 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So when
They
they're
never
with
have both parents.
right, when they're with dad, they're grieving mom. When they're with mom, they're grieving they're not seeing their dad. So if we can remember that, then we'll maybe put our mindset into, you know what I mean? Okay, so a little bit more compassion or something to understand what your kids are going through. It's just a good point. Like, I love that point because it's like, oh yeah, I'm grieving, but they're grieving too. And they could be grieving, yeah, a lot. So
It must be incredibly hard when you're grieving as an adult to also need to support your children and find that space to also take care of them in that context and deal with their grief, which could probably just add to your own.
yeah, and it's hard because especially with the teenagers, right, and young adults, because the young adults do grieve as well for grade divorces. If they know that you're grieving a lot, or they may not come to you anyways because they don't want to
Yeah.
burden you,
Yeah.
right? For me personally, when I went through my own, any heavy grieving I did in the forest, right? I took my
Interesting.
dog
Okay.
and I went for a walk, and some of that emotion came out. But I tried not to do any heavy emotional work in front of my children because they don't need that. They need to know you're human, but they're going through their own, and they don't need that on top of what they're going through. So
Yeah, because then you end up also with some sort of parentification where the child takes care of the parent because they feel
yeah,
they need to step up for them, which is definitely not
yeah,
an additional burden you want to be giving them.
yeah, and that happens.
And so for parents who notice that their children are really struggling with the grief they have from the life they knew falling apart or changing at least, how can they support their children throughout the divorce and help them through that grief?
Well, I would say that most kids are going to struggle a little bit. Okay, you've just taken their foundation of life, of what they've known, for most, because sometimes ones that have been in high conflict, they may feel relief as well.
As well.
Yeah, it doesn't mean they're not sad about their house or the shifting community, right? It's just that they could feel some relief. But parents, if their behaviors are continuing going down the wrong way, like you've seen some major patterns, you could always see a therapist that deal with children. Make sure they know about the grief of divorce. There's a clinician just down the street from me that works on behaviors with children, and she's worked with people that have gone through divorce because they need a safe space to talk as well.
Yeah.
And also parents also have to learn how to handle and what they're giving off. Another thing is like kids feel everything. So the way if you're feeling tense and you're hugging or you're sad, they feel it in your body, right? And they pick up on things. So we have to be really, really careful. I mean, we're not really going to talk about how kids feel in front of, like how kids are when parents have high conflict, right? Or they're arguing, because we both know how detrimental that is. But I would watch out for behaviors that are continuing, right? Like if you're getting the odd slam door from your tween, one, it's hormonal, but two, it's what we're going through, right? So it's what they could be going through. If you're finding, the 3 or 4-year-old is still regressing and it's not slowly transitioning over, I would seek help. I would just try to, it's hard because you're going through so much of your own stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're trying to keep on touch of everything else. I would do check-ins every couple of weeks with the teenagers. You could talk to the teachers just to make sure without crossing that line, that's what I would do.
An element of Just letting them grieve. I mean, it's part of the
Yes.
process, isn't it? You don't necessarily
Yeah.
want to fight the grief.
No, I always say to lean into it.
Yeah.
Like lean into it. But understand that if the 4-year-old is having massive temper tantrums again, right? Like they've outgrew it, but maybe, oh, this could be the grief as well. Because not everybody's going to emote emotion, right?
That's
Like
true.
even for us, um, we are either instrumental where we'll show our grief, or we're instrumental where we don't, sorry, to correct, instrumental where we won't show our grief, we'll think our way through, right? We'll do things, we'll walk, we'll
Yeah.
go to the gym, we'll build things or something. And then you have intuitive, which is the ones that'll be like, okay, I'm showing my emotion. Kids might not always show you tears, right? They're gonna, just like we don't. So
Yeah.
just watch out for things like I said before, some behavioral changes, grades, regression, manipulation stuff. Like just watch. Most kids do, if the co-parenting is decent, right? As you know as well, most kids will balance out and do okay. But the grief component is really truly there, and you're right. Let it out. Let them do it. It's just that be aware that they don't grieve the same way we do, for most part.
And I guess for the parents or the adults getting divorced, it's also about accepting the grief and leaning into it. Are there any other coping strategies that you recommend for them to move past that grief at some point?
Well, you need to be aware that you're grieving, like we said.
Yeah.
And coping strategies, I mean, I could, there's so many different ones, right? Like a lot of tools, one of the tools I use a lot is narrative therapy, right? Where you need to tell the divorce story. We need to write out the divorce story, need to understand what happened, right? Because maybe, that it's very good. I think it's called cognitive adaptation. So it helps you understand your story. So that's one of the tools I use. Again, it depends on who you are as the person, right? So when I work with people, it's navigating to where you are. So the tools can be, but what you said before is you have to, one, you have to be aware, but two, you really need to lean in when it comes, right? So however it comes up for you, right? Like you feel like you have to walk a marathon, then maybe you need to walk that marathon, right? Like if emotion come up, then maybe, there's something going on, you need to let it out sometime, right? Like lean into it. Get support when you need it. A lot of times I had a lady that had been divorced 20 years. And when I was working with her, she had not released any of that pain and she had stayed stuck, right? So it is really hard to face that, to face the pain. And that's why we as humans, we avoid it. But I really do think if you lean into it, if you're really struggling, seek support. I also want to mention that make sure you have the right support systems, right? So I call it, it's an exercise in our workbook where it's called the 4 pillars of support. And you have to write down the professionals you have. So say, oh, I have Chloe. Okay. I have my lawyer. I have my financial advisor. I have my real estate. Okay. There's my professional team. Well, then second, I have my family and friends. But another exercise I have in the book is, are they good friends and family? Are they enabling your bad behavior or are they not? Are they supporting you the right way? Right. Because okay, you're not married to this person anymore. It doesn't, and they're a jerk, whatever. And that's okay for a while, but after a while, you need to move forward and not have to be. So be careful with friends and family that way. So it's like friends and family support. And then peers, right? So I've done a lot of support groups in my life. And another big facet is that really helps people is getting the right peer support. So it's getting individuals like that are like you and I that have been through divorce, that can help you understand it or just talk together. So peers are support, and then yourself, right? Like you have to count on yourself. Like you have to slowly build up your foundation again, slowly build up your life, adjust to everything. And that takes work. It takes work in death loss and it takes work in divorce loss. So I don't know if that answered the questions because I went on a tangent there.
Very much so. And I agree. I think it is about being surrounded by the right people. And what it requires to start with is recognizing that you are grieving and that you need that help.
Yeah.
I do think that it is difficult for people to ask for that help in the context of divorce. And interestingly enough, I've seen it a few times with clients who were the decision makers themselves and still were grieving.
Oh,
And
yes.
they found it very difficult to get support because people are saying, well, you decided, it was your decision.
Mhm.
Why are you upset?
Mhm.
And so it can be very difficult for people to recognize that even though if you've come to the conclusion that you can't continue living with this person, doesn't mean that that's an easy decision to make, and it doesn't mean that you're not losing something in the process.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had that myself. It was unhealthy, abusive marriage, and I was crying, which is interesting, right? But there were so many. Another thing is what people don't understand who've not been through this, and that's where I help clients, is that there's lots of layers of loss, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
just I've lost this person. It's like I feel like a failure,
Mm,
right? That comes up a lot, right? I
yeah.
feel like I failed. I'm a bit embarrassed. I did everything right. It still didn't work. I've had one client that said, I've really, like, she decided to leave. She goes, I really let him down, but I
Oh.
just don't see it working anymore. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's a
There's
lot
more the
of
guilt
layers
side.
there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's guilt too. Yeah. So, um, there's also can be relief as
Mhm.
well as grief. And that gets
Yeah.
messy because they're like, I'm relieved. And then the next day I'm on the floor crying and I'm angry. And it's quite interesting. And just know that they work through it and allow it.
Yeah.
I actually just did a workshop about crying,
No.
and they
Yeah.
find that, yeah, and they find that if you're able to release that, like
Mm-hmm.
really, it actually is helping with the healing process.
Mm. So letting it out
Yeah,
actually helps you move on. Well, that's kind of the principle
yeah.
of therapy, just getting things out of your head and out of your heart to spill it out so that it is no
Mhm.
longer, you know, feeling you're no longer feeling stuck.
Yeah,
And
and you don't
so
want to
what
feel stuck. It's hard enough. Sorry.
yeah, for sure. And then one of the things that we often talk about is kind of the curve of grief, right? The different stages of grief that people go through. And what the one thing that's always bothered me with this curve is that it makes it look like a linear process. And I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about how permanent healing might be from grief, or whether it's something that might reemerge several times during your life. Is there such a thing as permanent recovery, or is it just that you eventually get better at handling it?
Yeah, so I'm going to there's no 5 stages of grief. It's still being taught.
Yeah,
In Thanatology, we don't do stages of grief. A lot of grief is not linear. So um, it'll come and go. Like I said to you, that's a good example. One day you're feeling, yeah, this is the best decision I made. I'm so happy. I'm done with this person. The next day you're like, you're weeping because you saw a film that you two saw 10 years ago when things were happier, right?
yeah,
Like it is more of a roller coaster. It's more what I say, the model I use is called dual process model, and it's
mhm,
more like loss orientated to restorative orientated, and it goes bing, 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 bing,
yeah,
bing. So you understand? So that's kind of like you go into a loss moment. It could be a few days. You're missing your kids. You're not used to that. And then restorative, you're feeling really good. You got a new job, and you know what I mean? And you're rebuilding a loss, like, so it goes back and forth until we integrate it
yeah,
more. So we call it integrating. And it depends on the type of marriage you had, whether you're going to feel grief forever, right?
yeah,
But I do think that there is an element that I have not come across anybody that has not felt at least some form of grief from divorce.
yeah,
It could be more materialistic, like I lost my house that I loved and I spent 20 years in, because they felt a lot of relief and not a lot of love in that marriage.
yeah,
Or it could be that they're devastated because they didn't want the divorce and they still love. So it all is so different. But yeah, most it's grieving can last and be integrated and can come up anytime. It can come up 10 years from
yeah,
now. You could be at your daughter or son's wedding and you feel a little twinge, like, yeah, that kind of hurts. Or it just you know, it just sucks, right? Like that we didn't make it work, right? Like, so yeah, there's no closure in my world anyways, because I can't be judgmental about that, because I don't, you know, I don't believe in closure per se. I just believe in more integration and recovering.
I think that's one of the misperceptions that's out there, both from the people who are grieving and the people who surround them. You know, this idea that after a while you should be better, you should have moved on, and then they get caught off guard when things reemerge. But one of the things I've heard, I have a friend who lost her daughter, so a terrible grief, losing a child. And she explains this, it never goes away, it just hurts a little bit less every day. But that grief is going to be with her whole life. And I think, for you know, depending on the context, of course, that's a very dramatic situation, but it will be potentially something that you have to live with for a while, if not
For
forever.
sure.
And for people around you to understand that they can't say, well, you've been divorced a year now, enough. We don't want to hear about this anymore.
Yeah, the problem is that even with your friend, and I've counseled many mothers who've lost children, and it's by far one of the hardest losses, right? Or the hardest loss. So she's right. She'll grieve forever. And the problem is with society as well, is like, okay, and let's go back to divorce, is like, okay, well, you're a year, that's good. Well, grief is so unique, and society doesn't support. They get tired of it. They're like, okay, like, and they get tired of it even in the death loss, right? They're like, okay, well, we've given you enough support. You're, you know, and it's only a natural order of things. Like it's not really society's fault. It's just who we are, right? Like grief is so personal, and it's very unique and alone on yourself. Like you're very, so with one couple, like one lady, you know, she's really sad. She could be sad and integrating for quite a while, where you might be like 6 months and you don't. But society wants you to keep going forward fast, right?
Yeah.
Like that's unfortunate, because that puts a lot of pressure on the griever to do that. And the griever's like, yeah, but that's why I like the peer model too, where you have peers, because they can, with death loss as well as divorce loss, because then because then they can kind of, because if you've not been through a divorce or that type of death loss, do you really understand? And you need a lot of understanding, you need a lot of some connections that way.
And I love the message that it is very individual journey, and there is no steadfast rule that, you know, it should take X amount of time. And I'm sure you get that too, but I get asked so often with clients, how long will it take until I feel ready to date again? And I always kind of laugh, because it depends. You know, some people need years, some people are ready to get back on the bandwagon within a few weeks or months. It has to do with your own journey and when you feel ready, when you've reconnected with yourself enough. But there's these expectations that there has to be a set timeline, and I think it sets everybody up for disappointment, because when you feel like you're failing because you haven't met that timeline, and there's no reason why you would.
No, but that's society, right? Like you have to, come on, let's keep moving forward. And I think, as you said, it's so unique, right? You could have been in a marriage that was very lonely, and you weren't connecting at all, and you weren't hardly talking, and, you know, you left and you want to date right away. Or right, or like, it's so, like you said, so unique. It's just, there is no timeline in any of this. And
this is so interesting. I would love to talk more and more, but I'm conscious of time, and I like to finish my podcast with a last question, which is really focused on kind of actions and tips that you can share for somebody who's experiencing grief as part of their divorce. What would be your top 3 tips to them?
So this is kind of summarizing up the podcast, because
Probably.
right, because one, be aware that you're actually grieving, right? Sit down and actually think, I could be grieving here. This isn't just me being angry or overwhelmed. I could actually, you know, be experiencing grief. Two, we talked about the symptoms, right? Like, so awareness and knowing that there's symptoms can help you kind of go, oh yeah, okay, so that's kind of, good, because also it helps you kind of understand yourself better, right?
Yeah.
And then 3 is it's there's a lot of other components, but lean into it when you feel it, how you
Yeah.
feel it, right?
Yeah.
So those are the 3 things on the top of my head that we talked about today that I think is important for people to start anyways.
Yeah, I think they're great tips, and I think they'll be very helpful for those who are going through that, because I think we need to be more aware of these things and to be more forgiving with ourselves as well as we
Mhm,
experience these emotions. And that's a lot of the work that you and I do with our clients is helping
mhm,
them recognize those emotions, embrace them, accept them as part of the journey, and just not let them dictate everything they do over
mhm.
the next few months. This is really helpful. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm going to include your contact details in the episode description. So if anybody wants to reach out to you or understand a bit more about what you do, read your book, I'll include
Yep.
all of that and it'll all be available there. And thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you for having me on. It was always a pleasure, Chloe.
Take care.